Okay, so today our focal point is going to be about correlations. So this is another type of research. Remember when we did the fingers, we had correlations as our pinky because it shows relationships. So this is talked about in pages 26 to 28 of your text. And we'll be getting to that. But before we do, okay, the assignment that you had before this was about descriptive research, where you read those articles, you look for advantages and disadvantages and examples and all that. So let's do this, okay? Let's put this into our notes just so we have, some organized notes that follow with the Roman numerals. So Roman numeral 1, remember, was experimental research or experimental method. Roman numeral 2 here is going to be descriptive research. But you don't see any equal signs here. You're not going to have to write anything for these because they're all in your chart. So I wrote, as you can see here, I wrote C chart from assignment. You've already got this down. But I do think you should pause me and just write these within your notebook to keep a flow rolling. And also because we are going to talk about measuring descriptive research, just like we talked about measuring the experimental method. Okay, so pause me, write this down verbatim without adding anything. And when you come back, we'll be at our next screen. Okay, so we want to measure descriptive research just like we measured experimental research. And one way we do that is by something called central tendency. We have 3 measures of central tendency. You've heard of these somewhere down the road. You've heard of the mean, median, and mode. So the mean is simply the average. Okay. The median, just like a median in a road, is the middle score. And the mode is the most often occurring, right? MO mode, MO most. So if we look at these, that first set of numbers, we have 7, 12, 11, 5, and 5, right? So if we add those up, that's going to be 40, and there are 5 numbers there. So the mean will be 8. All right, the median or the middle score, if I lay these out, I'll lay it out 5, 5, 7, 11, 12, and the median, the one in the middle, will be 7. And the mode, the most often occurring, is 5 because we see that twice. Okay, so I want you to pause and I want you to figure out the mean, median, and mode for the set of numbers down here. Okay, so pause me and take some time and figure those out, because there will be a question or two on the multiple choice, and you want to score these because those should be pretty easy ones. You're not going to even need a calculator, I don't think. If you do, you can obviously use one, but so pause me and see how you do mean, median, and mode for those. So hopefully you came up with these numbers, the mean being 6 because you add those up. And there are 6 wait, the mean might be 5. Let me see. Yeah. So I'll change that. Awesome. Okay, so 10, 17, and 13 is 30. And because there are 6 numbers, not 5, our mean is 5. Our median, this is the challenging one. In this, because you have an even set of numbers. When you have an odd set of numbers, the median is easy. It's just right in the middle, but now we have 2. So all we're going to do is we're going to take these 2 numbers and divide by 2, and our median then is going to be 4.5. Okay, and our most often occurring is 3. That occurs twice, and no other one occurs more than that. So there you go. We also want to look at the variation of these scores, and there's 2 ways that we look at variation of scores. One is the range, and one is called standard deviation. The range is really simple. It's the difference between the highest and lowest numbers. So the range of this set would be 5 because 8 is the highest and 3 is the lowest. And that tells us that. Again, pretty simple, straightforward. Standard deviation is a little more complex, but we don't have to worry too much about its complexity. For our purposes, we are simply going to say that standard deviation is how much the scores vary, V-A-R-Y, from the mean, okay? So the range is the difference between the highest and lowest, and the standard deviation is how much the scores vary from the mean. Again, we're not going to have to figure that out, but I do want to mention that standard deviation tells us about consistency. So for example, let's say that you're on a bowling team and one of your teammates backs out and you have two bowlers that want to be part of your team and they both average 200. Okay, so it's pretty difficult to decide because the average is the same. So then you say, well, let's look at your last 5 games, right? And the first person says, well, my last 5 games were 205, 195, 200, 201, and 191. So that's pretty consistent. That would have a really low standard deviation. Okay. The second bowler says, well, my average is 200. I had a game of 250, a game of 150, a game of 225, a game of 175, and then a game of 200. Well, they both average 200, but that second person isn't very consistent. They would have a really high standard deviation. Okay. So that's what standard deviation helps us to understand. Again, we're going to actually see standard deviation later in the semester in a more specific way. But for now, for this chapter or unit, that's all we need to worry about. Okay. So our 5th type of research. So remember that we had experimental method first. You just went through the 3 descriptive types: survey, case study, naturalistic observation. And now we're going to talk about correlation. All right. So we're going to define correlational research. I'll give you a second to take a look at this. So we have a Roman numeral 3, right? Correlational research measures the relationship between 2 variables. Okay, measures the relationship between 2 variables. And in parentheses, I want to add something that's going to be really important, and you're going to hear it a lot during this video. Okay, in parentheses, let's add, but does not show cause effect. Okay, so types of correlation or correlational research, is measures the relationship between 2 variables. And in parentheses, we're going to say, but does not show cause effect. Okay, and there are 3 types of correlations. We have positive, negative, and no. Okay, so we have to be able to distinguish these. There'll be questions on the test that ask, is this a positive correlation or is this a negative correlation, and that type of thing. So a positive correlation is when 2 variables occur together. And okay, so a positive correlation when 2 variables occur together. They can go up together or they can go down together. So one of the things we have to be careful of is positive does not mean good and negative does not mean bad. Okay, they're just telling you whether they're together or not. Okay, so a positive correlation is when 2 variables occur together. So for example, the more a person schedules their time, the higher their grade point average might be. Okay, so how much a person schedules their time and their grade point average are going to be a positive correlation. The less someone schedules their time, the lower their grade point average. Or the lower the person's grade point average, the more defeated they might be and the less they're going to schedule time. So they're both going up together or down together. We know that there's a high positive correlation between deep sleep and exercise. Okay. Are people exercising because they sleep well? Maybe. Are people sleeping better because they're exercising? Maybe. We don't know for sure, but we do, because it's not a cause-effect relationship, right? But we do know that there is a relationship. Okay. And because they're occurring together, it's a positive correlation. A negative correlation sometimes is referred to as an inverse relationship or inverse correlation. So maybe in parentheses before we define it, write inverse. And we'll define a negative correlation as when one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. One variable goes up, the other variable goes down. Okay. So for example, as exercise goes up, resting heart rate goes down. Okay. So if you check someone's resting heart rate now, if they haven't exercised and then they exercise for a month, their resting heart rate's probably going to go down. Okay, so we see that inverse relationship. All right. Then we have a no correlation. Okay. Or let me go to negative correlation. No, we'll go to no correlation. I'll come back to that negative correlation later. So no correlation is just what it sounds like. There is no relationship between the two variables. Okay, there is no relationship between the two variables. So shoe size and enjoyment of watermelon. Okay, there's probably no relationship there that I'm aware of. Okay, so that's what we would say for those three types of correlations. Okay, so let's talk about advantages of correlational research. One thing that correlational research does is it gives us predictive value. So again, we're talking about predictive value. If you're telling me that you're struggling with online education, and I say, well, some students have been scheduling and they've been saying that things are better for them grade-wise, so I'm making a prediction that if I schedule ahead, then maybe I'll do better, right? So it gives us predictive value. So let's say this for predictive value, that one variable helps us to predict another variable. Okay, one variable helps us to predict another variable. The other thing that it does is, and you can write the word ethics, and we'll define this one first and then I'll give you an example. So ethics, what I'm referring to is it allows us to study things that are unethical to research. Okay, it allows us to study things that are unethical to research. Okay, let me give you an example. Okay, so for example, children of alcoholics are more likely to either marry or become an alcoholic than children of non-alcoholics. Okay, I'll say that again. Children of alcoholics are more likely to either become or marry alcoholics than children of non-alcoholics. Can you do that with research? Can you take 200 people, randomly assign them to the experimental group where you're going to create an alcoholic home, and the control group where you're not going to create an alcoholic home, and then compare the results? No, that would be unethical, right? You can't do that. So what we do is we look at a relationship between the two. So what they'll do is probably a form of, combining surveys and case studies a little bit and turning it into a correlation where we're going to look for that relationship. Okay, another relationship that's kind of interesting, correlation, is if you know the statistic that children of alcoholics tend to either marry or become alcoholics at a higher rate than children of non-alcoholics, that reduces the likelihood that you'll become or marry one. So if we have three groups of people, one group of people comes from a non-alcoholic home, second group of people come from an alcoholic home but don't know the statistic, and the third group of people come from an alcoholic home and they know the statistic that children of alcoholics are more likely to become an alcoholic, blah, 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 then that third group that knows the statistic is going to be less likely to either marry or become one. So those are correlations. We don't know the cause effect, though. We can't say that. You can't say that coming from an alcoholic home causes you to either marry or become an alcoholic, because that's not true, because there are more people who don't do that. I'm not saying that you're like have a much greater chance. You just have a greater chance. So it's not a cause-effect relationship. Okay. Some disadvantages of correlations. First of all, again, correlation does not mean causation. We tend to automatically look to causation. So you have to be really, really careful of that. And that's our brain. We're going to talk about that in the semester as well, that our brain has a mechanism in it that automatically looks for cause effect, because that helps us survive. If I eat this plant and I get sick, I will not eat that plant anymore. And sometimes we look for that. Like right now, the pandemic, you're seeing that, everyone's blaming others and looking for causes and trying to find it. And we're struggling with it, and we're struggling with what to do because we've never been in a situation, at this time period like this before. So our cause effect brain is really struggling right now. So correlation does not mean causation. Okay. Secondly, we talk about something called directionality, and this kind of relates to the correlation causation one. Directionality, what we're referring to is one of the variables does not, again, cause the second variable. One variable does not necessarily cause the second variable. Let me give you an example of directionality that I think is pretty evident. So there is a positive correlation between number of hours watching television and adolescent obesity. Okay, so the more adolescent obesity, the more television hours are watched. So your cause effect brain right now is trying to figure out what's causing what. So you're probably thinking, well, because they're sitting home watching television, that's why they're obese. Or maybe you're thinking the opposite. Well, they're obese, so they don't have a lot of maybe energy or friends or that type of thing, so that's why they're watching television. And the reality is that we look at the research and we can't identify it. There is one does not cause the other; they just happen together. Okay, so that's an example of directionality. Another example is a third variable. A third variable means that there is something else out there that has a bigger impact than the two variables that are happening together. Okay, I'll say that again. There's something else out there that is having a bigger impact on the two variables. We'll just leave it at that. Okay. For example, okay, I'm going to give you some wait time on this. Positive correlation between ice cream sales and murder. Okay, positive correlation between ice cream sales and murder. It's a real correlation. Okay, so some of you are thinking about this and you're trying to, again, your cause effect brain, is it going on? I've had students say things like, well, it's because you're waiting in line for the ice cream and then you get mad, so then you kill somebody. Well, I hope not. But that's an answer, even though it's not the right answer. So again, people are trying to figure out, why would ice cream sales cause murder, or why would murder cause ice cream? It's not a cause effect relationship. In fact, the relationship in and of itself is caused by, if you will, a third variable. There's a third variable that is coming into play that's having a bigger impact on these two variables. Giving you some wait time to see if you know what it is. But if you think about it, the third variable is temperature. As temperature goes up, murder rates go up. A couple of reasons why, again, because your cause effect brain is trying to figure that out. When it gets really hot, we tend to become more short tempered. Also, when the hotter it becomes, the more people are out and doing things. So that's why that occurs. And of course, people are going to buy more ice cream, when it's warmer out or hotter out. So the third variable here is temperature, and those two variables actually are not necessarily occurring together in the sense that there's a third variable that's having a bigger impact. Okay. When we talk about measuring scatter or correlations, we measure them two ways. We measure correlations by scatter plots, and you can see that a positive correlation goes up from left to right. A negative correlation goes down from left to right, and no correlation has no pattern to it whatsoever, right? Also notice that the scatter plot is not a direct relationship. You're not going to have a direct line, for example. So if you look at positive correlation, and we go back to how much time you spend scheduling your time and GPA, the more scheduling, the higher the GPA, right? So a person who doesn't schedule very much probably has a lower GPA. Okay, now you're going to have some outliers, right? So this person has a low GPA even though they schedule a lot, and this person doesn't schedule hardly at all, but they have a pretty good GPA, or this person. But the general rule here is that we're seeing this arc. Okay, if we talk about the amount of exercise and resting heart rate, right? The lower the amount of exercise, the higher the resting heart rate. And the more the person exercises, then the lower the resting heart rate will be. Okay. So that's what we're referring to on negative correlation. Okay. Because the heart rate will be here. This is a high heart rate. low exercise, so that comes here. High exercise, low heart rate, so we see more here, and that's what you get this line. Enjoyment of watermelon, shoe size, all over the place, right? So no correlation. So again, on the test, you'll see a scatter plot, and you'll have to identify that's a positive correlation or negative correlation or no correlation. Okay. And finally, when we measure correlations, we measure them by something called a correlation coefficient. It's represented by R. R makes sense for relationship, right? So a correlation coefficient is a value from +1 to -1 that tells us the strength of the relationship. Okay, so I'm going to say that again, right? So a correlation coefficient is a value from +1 to -1 that tells us the strength of the relationship. So a +1 is a perfect relationship. A -1 is a perfect relationship. A 0 is a perfect no relationship. Okay, so you're rarely going to see those numbers. So a positive correlation coefficient is closer to +1. So it's right next to the equal sign, closer to a +1. A negative relationship or correlation is closer to a -1. And a no correlation is closer to 0. Okay. So of these relationships, we have a -0.38, a 0.84, a 0.12, a -0.91, and a 0.54. Which of these is the strongest relationship? Okay. Some people get tricked by this and they say 0.84 because they get locked into the positive number, but actually the strongest relationship is a -0.91 because -0.91 is closer to -1 than 0.84 is to +1. Okay, so in this example, -0.91 is a really, really, really strong negative correlation. Okay. So that is the topic of correlational research. Again, pages 26 to 28. It's the 5th type of research. Before we talked about that today, we just jotted down our notes just to keep them in order from the chart that you did, from the readings on case studies, surveys, naturalistic observation. We also talked about that measuring those 3 types of research is usually done by mean, median, and mode. We also look at the variation of those scores so we can see the consistency of them. Then we talked about correlational research and the fact that there are 3 types of correlational research. Positive, which are 2 things that occur together, either going up or going down. Negative, which one goes up, one goes down. And no, when there is no relationship. We talked about advantages and disadvantages of correlational research, and we talked about how we measure them. We measure them 2 ways, either in scatter plots or by looking at a correlation coefficient. All right, so again, be sure if you have questions, don't be afraid to shoot me an email or however we're going to figure out the best way to communicate this semester.